Hello again. We are here today for Class 8 of Latin American Studies 3300. And today what we will be covering are the topics of historical and cultural perspectives on Latin America and Central America, which is an area of Latin America that we have not yet talked about in any detail. Before I get to what I want to talk about today, let me make the following points. First, that for my part of class today, what I'm going to do is review and talk about some of the important points that came out of the last few lectures, which went over a great deal of material. They did it in a great deal of detail. And I thought it might be helpful if we stepped back for a moment and reviewed some of that to make sure that some of the really important ideas that were presented by Professors O'Brien, Professor Hart, and Professor Kugler were clear. They talked about the 19th century political history of Latin America, the Mexican Revolution, the 20th century political history of Latin America, and the economic history of 20th century Latin America. That's a lot to cover. It was covered in a lot of detail. In some cases, important points were discussed, but pretty rapidly. So again, I think it's useful to go over some of that material. The other topic that I will talk about today is to discuss an area that is often treated somewhat peripherally, and that is Central America. I want to talk about its history and then focus on the history of the largest and arguably most important country of Central America, that is Guatemala. And I want to do that for several reasons, in part because Guatemalan history is important in and of itself. It differs in certain ways from the history of Mexico and the history of some of the important countries of South America that we have heard about in great detail. And in and of itself, the history of Guatemala, therefore, has significance. But also for some of the topics that we will talk about and take up in the last weeks of the course, especially when I talk about gender and gender roles, especially women's history and women's roles, I will return to the country of Guatemala and talk about some examples of change from there. And so I think it will be useful to know something more general about the history of Guatemala. So that's what I will try to cover in my time today. In the second half of class, we will hear from Professor Mark Zimmerman. Professor Zimmerman is chair of the Modern and Classical Languages Department here on campus, a professor in that department who teaches about Spanish, and about cultural studies approaches to the study of language and literature. And he will be talking about cultural theory and concepts that can help us understand Latin America and Central America, both in terms of the history and the literature of these regions. And he'll also be talking some, I think, about the relationship between history and literature, something that we touched upon when Professor Zamora spoke in the first half of the class, and she will be speaking again specifically on the novel, and we'll come back to this issue of the relationship between history and literature. And Professor Zimmerman will also talk about that today. But first, what I want to do, as I said, is to do a review of some of the lectures that we've been watching and listening to over the last week. I also will talk about the countries of Central America and their earlier history, and I will talk about the new nations of Central America as these formed in the early 19th century, and then talk specifically about the history of Guatemala. I'm going to be asking you some questions along the way in terms of reviewing and making sure that you understand some of the concepts that we have talked about, and you should stop me if you have any questions that you want me to go over in more detail. Review first. Professors O'Brien, Hart, and Kugler talked about a lot of different issues and many different important aspects of Latin America's history, politics, and economy in the 19th and 20th centuries. We heard about the 19th and 20th century political history of Latin America as a whole from Dr. O'Brien. We heard about the Mexican Revolution as a microcosm, really, of revolutionary change in Latin America from Dr. Hart. And from Dr. Kugler, we heard about the economic history of 20th century Latin America, a history that in many ways is closely connected to the political history that we've talked about, but that can be understood on its own terms and in terms of the concepts that economists use. Because it's important to remember that Professor Kugler is an economist, not a historian, and she was really casting the history that she talked about in economic terms, which is very important. And the reason it's important is because you can pick up a newspaper any day, a magazine, many different news magazines or magazines of news analysis, read a lot about Latin America, and a lot of what you read about will largely be economic. And so it is important to understand the framework, the conceptual framework from which economists work and the concepts that they apply when they think about what's going on in Latin American economies. But before we get to that, I'm going to begin by reviewing Professor O'Brien's ideas about 19th and 20th century politics in Latin America. He talked about a lot of different ideas, it's an inelegant word, but I'll say it anyway. He talked about a lot of stuff. And he went over a large geographic region and a complex political history. If you had to summarize in any way what you think was important about what he had to say, without so much of the detail, what would you say? What do you think? How would you summarize it, or at least tell me one or two of his important points? What do you think those were? Any thoughts on that? Natalia.
I guess the summary of his lecture would be, I guess, the importance after independence of the groups of people who were fighting for power, and the difference between urbanization and sort of the regions that were the Pampas, and the struggle for power between the two, and the struggle to modernize in a country that had just, gotten independence in the region, and, just the struggle of power, modernization, and between caudillos and being conservatives and the liberals and so forth.
Okay, good. I think the struggle to power is something very important that he did talk about, and he talked about it for the 19th and 20th centuries. I think while not every country in Latin America has a region that's called the Pampas, every country has rural regions, and every country, of course, has cities. Cities were crucial in Latin America from the pre-Hispanic time on, but when we think about the presence of the Spanish, cities were crucial because cities were an important institution that the Spanish developed in their own ways. And there is this sort of almost struggle between cities, urban areas, and rural areas that occurs throughout Latin American history, but comes into real relief and becomes really a very important theme in Latin American history in the 19th and 20th centuries, as in Natalia's words, the area struggles to modernize. Because modernization will be difficult for a whole variety of reasons, And each of the last lectures, I think, shed some light on why that is the case, why that was the case. But the urban-rural divide is certainly an important element in understanding why modernization has been difficult. Do you have any other thoughts on an important point that he made as part of his lectures? When I went through the material that he talked about, I didn't do as good a job as Natalia did of boiling it down to one big point. I came up with 7 points out of his 2 lectures that I think are important and that I believe summarize a lot of what he had to say, and he filled in a whole lot more detail than I'm going to because I want to summarize his lectures. I don't want to repeat them. But I came up with 7 points that I think run across the lectures and that are important for you to be aware of, and I have put those on the PowerPoint outline for today. And I'll just quickly go through these points. The first one is that he was able to show, and he did emphasize, that Latin American political systems have a history of instability. There are a lot of different reasons for that instability. One of the important ones that he talked about as we take a look, especially at the 19th century, he emphasized the idea that when Spain no longer ruled Spanish America, it left a power vacuum. Because Spain, as you know, had developed a very centralized and bureaucratic imperial governing system. And the centralization of it, with bureaucrats and high officials having a lot of power, not total power, but having a lot of power and allowing for very little input into decision-making, meant that the Spanish had not left a strong base upon which Latin Americans had to build in order to develop their own systems of decision-making. So they have to develop those systems with a foundation that's pretty weak in a lot of ways. And that did lead to certain kinds of instability. Also, in relation to instability, he talked about the precarious relationship of the countries and economies of Latin America to the world economy. Now, of course, that's a point that Adriana Kugler also took up and discussed in more detail, so I'll come back to that. But he certainly did comment upon the difficulty of integrating Latin America's economies into the world economy in the 19th, then in the 20th century. So his first important point has to do with instability. Secondly, and related to the first point, is that out of that instability often came a tendency for strongmen, or caudillos, to dominate the political scene. While this was more true of the 19th than the 20th century, some of the strong figures of the 20th century can be seen as successors to the caudillos of that earlier century. Juan Perón in Argentina would be one whom I think the parallel could be drawn and the case for him easily made. I also actually think that's true of Fidel Castro, though he might object, I would say he would probably certainly object to that characterization. Nonetheless, I think that there is some truth to it. Though it's also the case that the role he has played in Cuba certainly has been influenced more by conditions and the history of Cuba itself than the tradition of caudillos. Number 3, the third point that was made is that while there are certain patterns that are general, a pattern like the rise and presence of caudillos or the struggle between liberals and conservatives, and I do want for a minute to come back to this issue of the struggle between liberals and conservatives for a minute before moving on. While there are these patterns that do cut across Latin America and its history, it is important to remember, it's very important to remember, that each country has a separate political history. That political history must be understood on its own. We can stand up here and make all sorts of generalizations about Latin America. We're all doing that. Nonetheless, there are important geographic, economic, and cultural differences that make for large contrasts among the countries. These differences create political differences, that is, different political histories, and sometimes these differences create political disputes and wars. So we do need to remember that while there are some general patterns and processes of change, each country in Latin America does have its own separate history, and I think that's one of the reasons that Professor O'Brien gave you lots of different examples from different places to show you the specifics of how change works out in a specific time and place. I do want to come back to the issue of liberal and conservative. One of the points that is most important for you to understand in the second half of this course is to understand the difference between liberal ideology and conservative ideology, particularly in 19th century Latin America. As Professor O'Brien explained, the terms liberal and conservative, as we understand them in the contemporary U.S. political scene, that understanding does not apply. The terms don't mean the same thing. So, if you had to define what is conservative or what is a liberal position or ideology in 19th century Latin America, how would you define either or both of those terms? Does anybody want to take a stab at that? Make a try?
I don't know about all of it, but I know that like conservatives wanted to keep the power of the church intact and keep them as part of the government.
Good.
And in the schools, and the liberals didn't. They wanted to secularize everything.
Right. A key to understanding the conservative position is exactly what has just been said. That is that conservatives wanted to maintain the control and power of the church. And that then extends to policies, for example, about education or other aspects of church practice which will later become state practice as a transition from church to state in terms of governance does take place across Latin America. A broader way of understanding the conservative position that takes into account this point, but is just a broader way, I think, of expressing or understanding the idea, is that fundamentally what conservatives want is to maintain forms of governance that are as colonial-like as possible within independent nations. Although some might have yearned for Spanish rule, they don't necessarily wish to be dependent and recolonized. But conservatives tended to like the structure and nature of colonial rule. They like the control over the economy that often came with colonial rule. They like the role of the church, as has been pointed out. They want to have economies that are controlled because they have less attraction to the idea of integrating into the world economy. They aren't sure that is such a good idea. And socially, one of the most important aspects of conservative ideology is social, and that is that they like hierarchy in terms of class and race, and they do not particularly want to see that change. And that has many implications And that issue over social hierarchy plays out in different ways in different parts of Latin America. One of the places that it plays out most dramatically, and one of the reasons I want to talk about this today, is Guatemala. Because Guatemala shows us, I think, it's a very dramatic case of the struggle over social hierarchy that the conflict between conservatives and liberals could lead to. So we've looked at the conservative position. What about the liberal position? Does anybody want to try to define any aspect of liberal, 19th century Latin American liberal ideology? Well, if conservatives want to maintain a more colonial-like government and ideology, what would liberals want? Liberals want to modernize. And liberals are the modernizers. They are the people who are in favor of progress. They want progress. They want change. They are more willing to experiment with ideas of change. They want to clamp down on the power of the church and the role of the church. They want it to be more controlled. Interestingly about hierarchy, it would not be correct to say that liberals want to do away with all hierarchy, because they are not communists. They don't believe in equality for all. But they do want to abolish slavery. They do believe that Indians should become, that is, the indigenous population should become citizens who do not have special, for them, Indians will have neither special rights nor special obligations. They are to become citizens of the new nations like everyone else. In a place like Mexico, in a place like Guatemala, or some of the nations of South America that had large indigenous populations in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, that means a lot of struggle over what is the place of this large, often less educated, mainly rural population. How will their place be sorted out in these new and more modern nations as liberals envision them? It is important also to point out that the liberal-conservative conflict in each particular country has its own special elements. That is, there are some aspects of the ideology that varies, so that while I've described this in a general way, the nature of the ideology can vary according to place. But in general, the characteristics, as we've talked about them, do describe the conflict that occurred between liberals and conservatives across 19th century Latin America. Another point that Professor O'Brien made was that in 19th century Latin America, while the Spanish play a much lesser role, and they actually do have some presence in parts of Latin America, because Cuba and Puerto Rico, for example, did not become independent in the same period that most of the nations of Latin America did. But Spain had a much less of a role. It had a much reduced role. But he pointed out that while the Spanish had a lesser role, that did not mean that other powers didn't continue to play an important role. That is, there continues to be influence, first from the British in the 19th century, and then from the U.S. in the late 19th and throughout the 20th century. The British primarily interacted with Latin America in its search or through its search for new markets. The U.S. interacted in part in a search for markets, but also because the U.S. wanted stability. And the U.S. desire for stability in 20th century Latin America is a very important force in Latin American history. And it's one that we do need to recognize. When we read about Latin America in the news, much of that news is economic. Some of it is also political. And it is important to understand that when the U.S. comments on Latin America, that is, when the U.S. government comments on Latin America, it is almost always commenting. Its comments are almost always driven by this search for stability. And I think there was a question that I need to take. Yeah.
Yes, I was just wondering, you said that the liberals wanted to modernize and work for progress, but was that, at this point, was that still the European standard of modernization? Just because in my other classes, the liberals seemed like the bad guys too, just as like the conservatives.
I think liberals were influenced first by during the Age of Revolution. They were certainly influenced by ideas of democracy, republicanism, that is, representative forms of government. They were also influenced by the U.S. Constitution and the government of the United States as that developed in the early and into the mid-19th century. So certainly they were influenced by ideas coming from the outside, forms of government that were being experimented with or were developing in other parts of the world. But that was, I think, less because they were necessarily aligned with those governments and more because they were looking for models. And again, it comes less from their desire to impose those models in Latin America as they're searching for ideas and thinking about how can they make them work in a different context. And that goes back to that point about Spain having left a vacuum of institutions in many ways. So so liberals are searching for ideas. The other aspect of the liberal and conservative conflict that your question reminds me about is that liberals often were people who identified with the idea of a strong national government centered in a capital city. They wanted unified nations and strong governance that came from the center. Conservatives, on the other hand, often were elites who identified less with the idea of a unified nation with strong institutions of rule and more with the idea that provinces and rural areas, because these, of course, were often sites of these were centers for agriculture, these were also often sources of profit for the new nations. Conservatives often were identified with more local forms of rule, which could be plenty strong in certain ways, but because their position was not one about representative governance, but it was more a conflict about where is the locus, the location of rule, what is the most appropriate kind of country or federation to have. So, moving on from liberal and conservative, I think Professor O'Brien made the point about the evolution of outside powers, how that changed over time. In the 20th century, he talked about, and this is the fifth point, In the 20th century, he talked about the development of new political ideas, especially the ideas of populism and democracy, which became important values and ideas. The idea of democracy has been floating around Latin America during the 19th and 20th century. In the 20th century, a more concrete idea of what democracy is and how it should apply in terms of governance begins to develop. And populism, that is the notion that common people, non-elites, should have a voice in governance, these ideas become more important. And what happens in the 20th century, and Professor O'Brien traced this, is that broad new coalitions form that had not existed in the past. And those coalitions that form, and I'll give you a specific example of that when I talk about what Professor Hart had to say, as those coalitions formed, they played an important role in the political history of Latin America. In Argentina, the formation of working class coalitions, people who worked in different kinds of jobs, had different unions coming together, and then urban workers and rural workers or peasants coming together. This was important. In Mexico, it was critically important in terms of the development of the Mexican Revolution, and I'll come back to that point in a little while. Another point that Professor O'Brien made was that if the U.S. and Canada have tended over time towards centrist governments, and we could talk about whether that is or isn't the case, but I would argue that even though there are certainly clear differences between Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. in terms of their ideology, the way our political system works tends over time to push politicians, national-level politicians, towards the center, which is both good and bad, but we're not here to discuss that point. At any rate, if the U.S. and Canada tend over time to have centrist governments, Latin America, he said, and I agree, has been marked by more extreme variation. We have, on the one hand, the example of the communist revolution and government of Cuba. On the left, to the far right, we have the repressive governments, the repressive military governments of the 70s and 80s. In parts of Central and South America. And again, when I talk about Guatemala, I will give a very extreme example of a right-wing government. So we do have a history, I think, of these extreme reactions from the right and left. And that is, we could talk a long time about what the causes of that are, but in part, of course, that is a legacy of the liberal-conservative conflict of the 19th century. But the last point that Professor O'Brien made is that given that there are these cycles and extreme reactions, given that neither democracy nor social justice have come easily, thus the political history of Latin America tends to look like an endless cycle repeating itself. Yet, he argued that over time, in fact, there have been great differences in the forms and goals of the political systems that developed. Professor Kugler made a similar point. I would say it's a little more inherent in her analysis. She didn't draw a lot of attention to it, but a similar point about economics was there in what she had to say. That is, while Latin American governments and economists have often had to deal with what are essentially similar problems over a long span of time, in fact, the nature of the problems and the kinds of solutions that develop have changed over time. And because there has been these changes in the nature of both the kinds of economic problems that have existed as well as in the possible economic solutions that have been envisioned, it has meant that that's one of the factors that has made the overall search for equality and social and economic justice quite difficult. But before we come to her points, let me go on and talk about the points that Professor Hart made when he talked about the Mexican Revolution and its importance. Here we're talking about a particular case study. We see some of the macro forces, in fact, many of the macro forces of change that Professor O'Brien talked about. These were encapsulated by Professor Hart in a detailed narrative of political change in which, in 1910, Mexico, and then in the 19-teens and 20s, classes, regions, ethnicities of Mexico repeatedly clashed until these were able, through political processes, to forge a more modern state that then became solidified in the 1930s and 40s. And then one of the amazing things about that state and political system that developed as Mexico came out of its revolution is that that state and political system then remained stable from the 1930s well into the 1980s. It began to destabilize in the late 80s and during the 90s, and then in the year 2000 you finally have the first president elected who is not part of the PRI, the institutionalized Revolutionary Party. And of course the name of the PRI in and of itself, I think, captures the contradiction inherent in Mexican history in the second half of the 20th century, and that is, how do you institutionalize a revolution? Can a revolution, which is in and of itself about enormous change, can revolutionary change be institutionalized? Professor Hart was addressing questions that had more to do with the causes and the nature of the revolution itself. And I would say that in his lecture, and you can see on the outline over here, that he emphasized 3 points. First, he started out by telling us about the international context, the global context of political change in the very early 20th century. And what he pointed out to us is that just as in the period of independence in Latin America, there are political changes taking place in other parts of the world that influence what happens in Latin America, this is also true in the early 20th century. And the Mexican Revolution doesn't come out of nowhere. It is in response to forces that are being felt in other parts of the world as well. And he talked about Russia and Iran in particular, and if I remember correctly, I think he also mentioned China. Now, this is not to say, and it is important to stress the following point, this is not to say, to put this at its most simple and least subtle, it's not to say that the Russian Revolution caused the Mexican Revolution, because that's not what he was saying. And that's an important point to make, not because it's some genius observation, because it isn't at all. It's an important point because one of the things that I don't want to be heard saying is that Latin America has not come up with its own political ideas, because I believe that it has. It's come up with its own politics, its own economics, its own cultural ideas and history, It is not simply a taker. It does not simply absorb ideas from elsewhere and then repeat them in a Latin American context. In a global world, and I would argue that we've lived in a global world since the 16th century. In a global world, ideas spread. Ideas spread, people travel, material goods certainly travel and spread. So I think in a global world, every place is experiencing aspects of influence, elements of influence from other places. And the interesting question is, what does any part of the world do with some of those influences? So Professor Hart reminded us of the importance of the international context for Mexico in the early 20th century. But he then talked about the development of the Mexican Revolution, and for him, the revolution was in large part a class struggle, with non-elites reacting to the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, reacting to the wealth and the relationship of Diaz and the modernizing elites of Mexico, and saying, no, we've had enough, we don't have enough of a part in this, we're not sharing in the wealth or social changes that are taking place. But he also carefully points out that while the Mexican Revolution can certainly be understood as a class struggle or clash between elites and non-elites or the masses, that in each sector, in the elite sector and in the mass sector, but especially in the mass sector isn't just made up of a huge conglomeration of people who magically share the same ideas. Urban workers who do various kinds of industrial work have a lot of different ideas from rural peasants. And there are other kinds of differences as well. There is, of course, urban-rural, occupation, region, and he talked a lot about the North, what happens in the North and what happens in the South. And one of the interesting things in the Mexican Revolution is how leadership and forces from the North and the South eventually come together. He talked about ethnicity as well. And one of his points is really that the Mexican Revolution probably would not have happened without this coalition, this massive coalition that came together for a certain point in time and brought about a radical revolution. A revolution that, if not communist, was well to the left, and that was associated with ideas, for example, of land redistribution. That is, leaders of the revolution, especially Zapata, but others as well, believed in the idea of expropriating land from the wealthy, from hacienda and plantation owners, and redistributing it to the landless. But Professor Hart also reminded us that revolutions do not always stay revolutionary forever. As governments consolidate, as what became the PRI in Mexico solidified and the state consolidated, fundamentally the class structure did not really change. That class structure was in many ways replicated and protected, even as the state distributed land and some of its newfound industrial wealth, in what ultimately became a flawed search for social justice and equality, which is a big part of why and helps explain why ultimately the PRI fell from power. The PRI built one of the most brilliant machines of one-party rule ever. I think the PRI's significance is major in Mexico's history, but the PRI's importance goes way beyond the history of Mexico, because it really tells us something about the mechanisms that it takes to maintain one-party rule. Professor Kugler's lecture, in many ways, was also a discussion of the equality question. She asked, why has it been that greater economic and social equality has been very hard to develop in 20th century Latin America? She argued that the answer lies in 20th century economies, and began by presenting figures that showed that the standard of living in 1820s Latin America was lower than that of the U.S. and Western Europe. That standard of living varied across Latin America, and she also pointed out that the standard of living in Latin America was by no means the lowest in the world. But certainly in terms of the hemisphere, and the hemisphere is one of our objects of comparison, certainly in terms of the hemisphere, the Latin American standard of living at the end of the 19th century was low. She then described how in the later 19th and early 20th century, even as Latin American economies modernized in the 19th century sense of that term, exports remained important. Exports were key to the economic development and growth of many countries in Latin America. This was especially true of the countries with some of the larger economies: Argentina, Mexico, Peru, Brazil. But this reliance on exports as the basis for economic development created problems. Some of the problems that the reliance on exports created are the following. First, it wasn't simply that Latin American countries relied on exports. It's the kind of exports that leads to some problems. Exports tended to be raw materials, raw commodities, agricultural, mineral. Given that these are raw materials, they're subject in and of themselves to problems in production. If Guatemala, for example, is dependent on banana export and there is a hurricane, there are not necessarily going to be too many bananas to export. So that's a problem right there. That the type of production and what is produced can in and of itself create a cycle in which the supply is not steady. So there are supply cycles that can be problematic. But there's another kind of cycle that's also problematic and can be very problematic. And we see this, we are particularly beholden to this in our own lives when we look at what happens with oil. Because in the last couple of months, for reasons that are not, maybe they're clearer to you than they are to me, but we've been seeing the price of gas go up. And that's good for oil producers, right? And real good for the oil companies. But the idea is, the real idea I want to get at here is that there are price cycles as well. And the producers of raw materials are dependent on those price cycles, and their own economies are heavily influenced by them. Development, modernization, is something that relies upon a steady flow of resources. And if your economy is built around the export of materials, the price of which cannot be steady due to many different global conditions that no country in and of itself can control, then development is likely to be problematic. So she talked about the problems that Latin American countries, even as they were developing their economies, the problems that they faced due to an over-reliance on export, particularly exports of raw materials. Beginning in the 1950s, economists within and beyond Latin America, but it is the case that Latin American economists in particular developed a policy that was intended to deal with the problem of dependence on imports. A problem based on development of exports. The policy that Latin American economists came up with and recommended was a policy known as Import Substitution Industrialization, or ISI. Again, the policy that was recommended was Import Substitution Industrialization, or ISI. A number of countries in particular benefited from it: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico. But even with ISI and the idea that countries should develop industrial capacity which will allow them to sell goods made in that country to citizens of that country, there were nonetheless problems. Some of the economies in Latin America strengthened, and relations of trade among Latin American countries themselves strengthened also, as different countries specialized in different kinds of goods, because not every country, of course, industrialized with the same exact industries. There were nonetheless some problems. First, heavy industry did not develop in a sustained way, so that the kinds of goods that were produced tended to be smaller consumer items. And that made it possible to develop economies to a certain extent, but it's heavy industry and really the export of goods produced through heavy industry that really can drive economic development. So she observed that heavy industries did not develop in a sustained way, and that most industries suffered from a lack of financing, so that there is also a limit on the amount of industrial development that could take place. She also noted that it was common for countries to place tariffs on their exports. Tariff is simply a tax that can be placed either on imported or exported goods. And tariffs make exported goods less competitive and imported goods more costly. And that's why there is this interest in so-called free trade. That's what underlies NAFTA, what underlies CAFTA, what underlies the Plan Pueblo, which I'll talk about a little bit either later or in the next class, depending on how quickly I get through my material. She went on to talk about what happened in the 1980s as ISI reached its limits. And that is that a debt crisis exploded because Latin American economies were suffering from huge inflation. That simply means prices were rising really rapidly. And because the amount of money that they had borrowed from abroad in order to finance their industrial efforts, their industrializing efforts, the amount of money they had borrowed had increased to the point where it was difficult, if not impossible, to repay it. In order to deal with these problems, Latin American countries began to print more money, which has the effect of leading to still more inflation. And they began to try to develop policies that would allow them to raise more revenue in order to repay loans. And they also began to discuss the idea of not repaying their loans. That conceivably could have led to a crisis in the world economic system. And the U.S. government, together with the important international financial institutions, especially the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, work with the countries of Latin America to combat these problems. They come up with plans to do a better job of collecting taxes to raise more revenues, plans to regularize the banking sector and modernize the banking sector more, so capital flows will work more efficiently. These plans involve having Latin American countries stop printing so much money. And a major feature of these plans was for Latin American countries to cut social spending so that they would have more revenue to spend on their external debt. In the late 80s and 90s, these plans were still needed. But increasingly, it was world financial institutions, again, especially the World Bank and the IMF, that played an important role. And though the World Bank and the IMF continued to work through the nation state, that is, through national governments, in order to develop programs and put into place programs that are known as structural reforms, world financial institutions also began to look beyond the state. Professor Kugler talked about specific programs of reform which go by the names altogether. They are described as a group as either structural reforms, or the term neoliberalism is also used as a word that describes these kinds of programs of reform. They include policies relating to trade, tax, and labor, freeing up trade, more efficient tax collection, cutting back on the rights and salaries of workers. So working with national government is still necessary. But another key element of structural reform was privatization. That is the idea that governments should not own corporations. There should not be state-owned or state-sponsored businesses. If businesses have to compete, they'll become more profitable. Allowing private ownership of state-owned corporations also meant that there could be an opening for large amounts of new investment from the outside world. Large flows of capital into Latin America, but this is capital that expects to make a profit. And what was interesting about this period is that the idea of selling off state-owned operations included sales of utilities even extending to things like water. So there are private water companies that want to own the rights to and the use of water. This degree of privatization led to a great amount of unhappiness. There was a very strong negative response to it. Nonetheless, the impact of structural reform was to shift, wealth, but wealth isn't really the correct term here. Let's just say a major impact of structural reform is to shift capital away from workers and middle and poorer sectors of society towards upper sectors. So there is a sort of redistribution of wealth from the bottom to the top, which seems counterintuitive, but it does happen. And it puts workers in much more vulnerable work environments. It helps governments pay off debt, but it comes at a high human cost. She concluded by arguing that Latin America continues to face obstacles to growth. It has weak political and economic institutions, in her view, and inequality and poverty remain very serious problems. As we've seen, she mentioned, and Professor O'Brien mentioned as well, Latin Americans are dealing with these issues politically by voting for governments that criticize neoliberal policies. What remains to be seen is whether governments from the left can create a more effective balance between the global economy and the economy and social needs of citizens. And it will be very fascinating, I think, just to conclude the review, it will be very fascinating to see how the different kinds of leftist governments that have come into power will carry out programs of reform and what effect those reforms will have. And I think there was a question.
Yes, I guess just regarding the structural reforms, are the structural reforms neoliberal? Is that what you said?
Yeah, the idea is that those terms are essentially synonyms.
Okay. All right.
Structural reform, the term structural reform is very specific to the economic programs of change. Neoliberalism includes, the term neoliberalism includes both ideas about economic change, but a political philosophy goes along with it. Sure.
Regarding the structural reforms too, once a lot of these countries who fell in debt and had to sell off some of their, like you were saying, utility plants and so forth, isn't that counter sort of making them more in debt? And not only that, but also being controlled by outside forces? Is that why you see such a shift to the left in a lot of governments where they're taking back these companies?
Yeah, it is true that it helps them deal with one set of debts, but then creates another kind of debt. And it does put these countries and businesses within them in a subjugated position, and it's certainly in a weak position in terms of their relationship to transnational corporations, in terms of their relationship to other governments, and their relationship to these world banking institutions. So it is somewhat paradoxical, as you point out. Nonetheless, at any particular point in time that a country or countries is dealing with a set of economic problems, they're constrained by the possibilities that are out there. And in terms of the world economic system, this is how, at the moment, it's organized. And so countries have little choice but to deal with the World Bank and the IMF in particular. Now, it will be interesting to see if a country like Venezuela, which has been less willing in its turn to the left to adhere to some aspects of globalization and the neoliberal program than a country like Brazil, whether it can be successful, because now in the spring of 2007, Venezuela is beginning to have some serious economic problems. And whether they, on their own terms, can solve those economic problems remains to be seen. But you're right, it does create a different set of problems to replace the older set of problems, though overall debt does decline, and that gives the countries of Latin America more maneuvering room economically. Okay, let me go on and talk about the countries in early history of Central America. I am guessing that I am not going to get to Guatemala, but I can use the section on Guatemala to begin to talk about that political history and some of its social implications in the next class. In terms of looking at Central America, by way of introduction, we can note that geographically it is part of North America. Culturally, it's part of Latin America. But the region of Central America is marked by a number of characteristics that set it off. One, it is marked by intense poverty. That doesn't mean other parts of Latin America aren't poor, but the standard of living is extremely low. And it has been very difficult to change that. And that's been the case from the independence period on. It also, from the colonial period on, has been seen as a somewhat peripheral area. Neither singly nor together do the nations of Central America represent the economic power that larger and more developed economies, such as those of Argentina, Mexico, or Brazil, represent. Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama constitute the countries that make up Central America. Again, Guatemala, Belize, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama are the countries that I'm talking about, though I will talk primarily about the first 5 because Panama did not become independent at the same time. It was part of Colombia well into the 19th century. And its history is in some ways related to the history of Central America more broadly, but also to the history of South America. So we'll hold Panama aside. The region of Central America was the place that the Spanish conquered and colonized after the conquest of Mexico. Many, though not all of its native peoples, were Maya. Other groups were distantly related to the Nahua peoples of central Mexico, who we talked about at the beginning of the semester. There were also some groups who were either related to native peoples of northern South America or who were actually native to this region. In other words, its indigenous peoples were quite varied culturally and linguistically. And in and of itself, that's a very interesting topic in terms of the history of indigenous peoples in Central America, which has varied a great deal, both by ethnicity and in terms of country. In terms of the colonial period and Spanish governance of the region, it was governed in ways similar, even identical to the forms of governance that we talked about that came along with Spanish colonial rule. It was governed quite similarly, but its peripheral, remote geographic position meant that there were fewer Spaniards, and that led to two possibilities in terms of the relationship between the Spanish, small in number, and the indigenous population, large in number. In parts of Central America, the Spanish, I wouldn't say they leave the indigenous population alone, that's overstating it, but they rule in a way that introduces change more slowly than in other parts of Latin America. There aren't as many Spaniards. And they simply don't have the number of people to create the kind of bureaucracy that they do elsewhere. At the same time, there is a sense in which the opposite happened. Not everywhere, but in certain parts of Central America, because there were so few Spaniards, Spanish colonists were under little oversight, and they could be very extreme at times in the way that they governed and dealt with native people. Slavery, real slavery, not the virtual slavery of encomienda that we talked about. Slavery existed in Central America when it wasn't supposed to exist at all, well into the colonial period. The practice of encomienda, which died out elsewhere, still existed in parts of Central America in the 19th century after there was independence. So being a peripheral region can be a rather contradictory experience in certain ways. When we get to the time of independence, again, we have a struggle for independence taking place in a region that's largely peripheral. Spain is not hugely concerned. They don't show much interest in the region. After the very early period, they don't show much interest in the region until the late colonial period, when certain kinds of agricultural goods, notably henequen, which is used for rope, and indigo, a dye, when the production of these goods takes off explosively, and these goods can be traded for high profit. All of a sudden, the Spanish, in particular, the Bourbon rulers, and bureaucrats of Spain are very interested in capturing revenue from this trade. This leads to the same kind of resentments that Bourbon economic policy and pressure led to elsewhere. But the Spanish are not going to put large amounts of troops in the region trying to keep it as part of the empire. When Mexico became independent, Central America did as well, and it became independent as part of Mexico. Mexico, however, was unable to govern Central America for more than a couple of years. In 1823, Guatemala and El Salvador claimed independence from Mexico, and they created the United Provinces of Central America with 5 provinces, Guatemala and El Salvador, of course, and Costa Rica, Honduras, and Nicaragua as well. This new country, however, did not survive as a unified country past 1838, and it barely survived between 1823 and 1838. The pressures for centralization were not very great. Elites did not want to pay taxes to this new central government. The government was not able to create an effective army. And the liberal and conservative struggle played out there as it did elsewhere in other parts of Latin America. In name, the central government survived until 1838, but it never existed as a strong presence. And in 1838, 5 very weak nations came to exist. The United Provinces fell apart, and each of these new nations experienced the problems of nation building that occurred elsewhere, that had occurred for the United Provinces and were occurring elsewhere in Latin America. They experienced the problems of nation building in very extreme form because of poverty, because of extreme inequality, because of the social differences that existed within populations, and because of the weak institutions of governance of both the colonial period and the very early national period. So what happens is that immediately following upon the creation of 5 independent countries, conservative caudillos come to power who will shape the history of Central America during the mid-19th century. I'm going to stop here, and we will pick up with more of the story of nation building and look at Guatemala in particular in the next class.